On Wednesday, April 23rd, the Karen Reed retrial saw day 2 of testimony. And as expected, the Commonwealth, of course, continued with its case in chief. First, it picked up with more of its direct examination of Kerry Roberts. Then the jury heard from Margret O'Keefe, John's mom. After that, they heard testimony from Massachusetts State Police Trooper Nicholas Guarino, and then from the Canton Fire Department paramedic Daniel Whitley. And like on day 1, in between these witnesses was a peppering of clips from Karen Reed's various interviews. And some of this testimony was totally new. For example, Mrs. O'Keefe did not testify the first time around, and I think her testimony came across very effectively. I mean, how could it not, right? She's the mother of the man who died in this case. But the day was not without some points on the board for the defense as well. Let's get into it. Okay, so really quick, I forgot to mention this in the day 1 recap, but if you are totally new to this case, I have a background video that I made before the first trial, as well as a few playlists from trial number 1 that you can follow in order to get caught up. Links to both of those are in the description below. Anyway, for everyone else that is otherwise all caught up, like I said, there was good and bad for both sides on day 2. Let's start with the Commonwealth's second witness, and the first witness of the day, Kerry Roberts. So there were basically 3 main parts to Kerry Roberts' testimony on day 2. First, there was her testimony about Karen Reed's alleged statements about her right rear taillight. Kerry says that at some point when they were outside John's house at Meadows Avenue the morning of January 29th, Karen pulled her and Jen aside to show them her cracked taillight. On cross-examination, it came up that she had originally said in previous testimony that this happened when Kerry pulled up her car right behind Karen's car when they originally arrived at John's house on Meadows Avenue to look for him. But on cross-examination, Jackson showed footage from John's Ring camera that shows that at no point when they initially arrived did any one of them stop to look at Karen's taillight. This was to highlight that Kerry has changed her testimony now to now say, I don't really remember whether it was when we arrived or when we were about to leave that Karen showed me her taillight. And interestingly enough, there is no existing Ring footage of the time when the 3 of them were leaving John's house. So there's no way to corroborate whether or not Karen showed them her taillight to point out that it was cracked when they were leaving. Honestly, the defense has already hinted to the jury about their theory as to how this taillight got cracked before this moment, so it doesn't really seem like it's crucial for the defense. But it does highlight inconsistencies in Kerry's testimony, which is always important for witness credibility. Anyway, then there was the part about Kerry, Jen, and Karen driving around looking for John and ultimately finding him, and the first responders trying to resuscitate him before taking him to the hospital. Then the third part was where Kerry was with John's family, and particularly John's parents, Margaret and John Sr. Kerry said that she took them to the hospital to see John and then took them to John's house on Meadows Avenue to be with John's niece and nephew so that they could all grieve together. There also was a bit on her direct examination about her connection with Officer Michael Link, a Canton PD officer who arrived at the scene on the morning of January 29th. The reason the Commonwealth brought this up is because in the first trial, it was the defense that brought up Kerry's connection with the Link family, if I remember correctly at least, and it looked a little bit suspicious as a result.
Don't be suspicious. John Ralphio?
Anyway, so this time I think the Commonwealth wanted to take the sting out of this and try to explain some of these things first to the jury. See, what happened was this. Kerry testified that before all of this went down, she had only met Jen McCabe once. But now Kerry says because they had just gone through this whole traumatic experience together, they quickly became BFFs and suddenly started spending a lot of time together. So the day after everything happened, Kerry says that she was driving her kids, Jen, and 1 or 2 of Jen's kids to the O'Keefe house. There, she says that she dropped off her son and Jen's kid or kids, presumably to spend time with John's niece or nephew. Then Kerry says her daughter wanted to spend time with her friend, who is the daughter of Officer Michael Lang. She says her daughter is in a tight friend group of like 5 people with Officer Lang's daughter, and because of that, Kerry is friends with Officer Lang's wife. So because Kerry's daughter wanted to spend time with her friend, she says that she and Jen drove Kerry's car to drop Kerry's daughter off at the Lank house. There, Officer Lank's wife got into the car's back seat to talk with Kerry and Jen for like 45 minutes. Kerry said that Officer Lank's wife went in there so that she could ask how they were doing because Canton being a small town, she had heard about what had happened the day before. At one point, Jen apparently had to go to the bathroom, so she said that she went inside the Lank house to use theirs. Now, on cross-examination, Alan Jackson did dig into this a bit to raise some suspicion, but he didn't rip into her her fully for it. However, he might do this later, maybe with Jen McCabe. But the defense definitely wants to lay the breadcrumbs here that Jen McCabe has basically tentacles everywhere when it comes to the local lay witnesses, and that her efforts are a piece of the alleged corruption cover-up by Trooper Proctor and the others in the police force who are investigating this case. And Jackson did a good job of highlighting this on cross-examination, where he pointed out that basically every time Kerry had some kind of an interview with the police, Jen just so happened to be there, whether physically or over the phone, right before or after, or maybe even during these interviews. Anyway, I think the Commonwealth did well by being the ones to bring this up, because when Kerry explained it, it is more or less reasonable. I do still wonder why Jen couldn't chauffeur her own kids around, like busy adults with teenagers usually do, especially when 48 hours before, Jen and Kerry barely knew each other. Even considering this being a traumatic event for all of them, which I grant that it probably almost definitely was. I don't know, I still have some skepticism around that detail. And the thing is, Jen does prove to be pretty omnipresent in Kerry's testimony. Not only was Jen hanging around during all or most of Kerry's interviews, but Jen and Kerry worked together to create a timeline of events right before one of these interviews. And this is something that was a big moment on cross-examination. That's because when it comes to the accuracy of the memory of a witness about the incidents that they're testifying about, they need to be independent of anyone else's memory. That's why there's a general rule that witnesses are not allowed to be in the courtroom for the testimony of other witnesses until they've finished their own testimony. You don't want to see a witness starting to conform their memory and their testimony as a result to what something else that another witness has said. And one example of this happening in Kerry's memory was regarding the 2:27 a.m. Google search. You see, Kerry had previously testified to the grand jury in this case that she had heard Karen ask Jen to Google hypothermia on the morning that John was found. This is because of Jen's 2:27 a.m. Google search, how long to die in cold, or how long to die in cold. The defense says that this is evidence that Jen knew John had died hours before Karen found him on the Albert's front lawn. But the Commonwealth says this 2:27 a.m. timestamp isn't what the defense says it is, because it was something that Jen Googled around 4 hours later upon Karen's request. In the first trial, Jen's testimony on the subject was almost talismanic. Every time the subject came up or she was asked about it, she'd say, Karen told me, Google hypothermia, Google how long to die in the cold. And so instead of describing how Jackson took all of this apart, let me just play a clip from the cross-examination here. Just before this clip, Jackson asks Kerry, during your grand jury testimony, Lally from the prosecution asked you, what, if anything, did she, Miss Reed, ask Miss McCabe while they were sitting in the back of the cruiser that you heard?
And in response to that question, you stated, quote, at one point she asked her to Google hypothermia and how long Google hypothermia. Correct? Mm-hmm. I'm sorry?
Yes.
That was very detailed, you'll agree, that that's a very detailed and specific recount of an event. You recounted where you were, back of a cruiser, or they were in the back of a cruiser, correct?
Yep.
You recorded or reported the time. It was right around the time that you thought they were lifting John up and scooped him up onto the gurney, correct?
Yep. I thought it was about that time. I wasn't sure.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that answer. You were talking over each other.
That's my mistake.
What was your answer, Ms. Roberts?
I thought it was about the time they lifted him up, but I wasn't sure.
Okay. You were very detailed about who was there. It was you. It was Jen. It was my client, Kerry
Yes.
Reed, correct? Is that right?
Yes.
You were so detailed that you talked about where you were standing next to the cruiser open door, correct?
Yes.
What the others were doing, holding hands and praying, is that right?
Yes.
And the actual words used, you were as detailed about all of that as the actual words used. She asked her to Google hypothermia and how long, and then you stopped, Google hypothermia, end quote, correct?
Correct.
You will agree, at least for that purpose, you painted a very, very detailed picture in front of the grand jury, didn't you?
Yeah.
Except it's not true, is it?
I did not hear her ask that. I was told she was asked that.
The answer to my question, Ms. Roberts, and it's not a trick question, what you told the grand jurors was not true. You never heard her, my client, ask anyone to Google anything, did you?
I did not.
And yet, that's what you testified to under oath, under penalty of perjury, in front of the grand jury, didn't you?
I did.
And the reason you did that, the reason that you said that false statement, was because someone told you to say it, correct?
Object.
Is that, I'm going to let her answer that.
Nobody told me to say it. I knew it happened at that time,
How did you
which
know
is why
it
I said it.
How did you know it happened, Ms. Roberts, if no one told you it happened?
Because we wrote a timeline. We already spoke about that.
The timeline that Jennifer McCabe helped you with, that influenced your testimony in front of the grand jury, correct? Obviously.
I was telling what happened in the back of the cruiser.
The timeline
Can you answer?
you wrote,
So when you ask a question, let her answer, okay?
the timeline you wrote, with Jennifer McCabe's help, influenced your testimony to testify in front of the grand jurors to a statement that you never heard, correct?
Yes.
That's pretty damaging because although Kerry does come across fairly sincerely throughout her testimony, when the jury sees what kind of personality Jen McCabe has, it just might look to them like Kerry has been totally manipulated by Jen to give false testimony. And that impacts the trustworthiness, the credibility of everything that Kerry says here. Okay, so that's Kerry's testimony. Next up was John's mother, Margret O'Keefe. But first, the Commonwealth played this clip.
When my car was seized, there was a few small pieces of taillight missing that I had picked out at John's at 5:45 before we drove over to Fairview. I'm showing Jen and Kerry, look what I just did to my light, and I'm worried that there's going to be some kind of electric short circuit. There's like the bulb is showing, and some of the red plastic's missing. So I picked pieces out of the light housing that had kind of collapsed within the light and dropped them in John's driveway.
So here we have, again, the defense doing a lot of work to take down a witness with inconsistencies, only to have the Commonwealth come in and use a Karen Reed statement from an interview where she was basically corroborating essentially what the witness said. Jackson clearly wants the jury to question whether Karen really showed Kerry her taillight, and here's Karen herself saying, I showed Kerry my taillight because I was worried about it. These statements might end up adding up to nothing, or maybe they'll end up being the death of 1,000 cuts of the defense's case. Time will tell. Okay, so next was Margret O'Keefe, John's mother. As anyone can imagine, her testimony was heart-wrenching. She told the story of how John had been taking care of his niece and nephew as their main guardian after Margaret's daughter Kristen died of cancer in 2013, and Kristen's husband died 2 months later of a heart attack. Like, say what you will about this case and the things that Paul O'Keefe, John's brother, may have said about Karen and whatnot, this family objectively has gone through more tragedy than most in a very short time span, and it would take a monster to not empathize with the heartbreak that Margaret has gone through, now having lost 2 of her 3 children. Now that I'm a mom, it obviously hits even harder to hear her testimony. Anyway, aside from giving the emotional story of losing John, Margaret also testified about some of the interactions with Karen. There's definitely a suggestion that before all of this happened, Margaret and Karen didn't have the best relationship, although it's not clear from the testimony why that is. One example of this is when Kerry was driving Margaret and John Sr. to the hospital, apparently they all talked with Karen on the phone. John Sr. asked Karen, what happened? And Karen responded with something like, there was a party, I left him there. And Margaret responded kind of incredulously, you left him? Kerry had previously testified about this too, and she said that John Sr. then said to Margaret, leave her alone, she's been through enough. Anyway, there were a couple other interactions that Margaret testified about. One was at the hospital where Margaret says Karen yelled across the hall, Peg, is he dead? Is he dead, Peg? Peg, of course, is a nickname for Margaret. But Margaret says that she never responded directly to Karen, she just turned to a nurse nurse that was with her and asked, what is she doing here? And apparently the nurse said she's here for a psych eval. So then the final interaction was later that day back at Meadows Avenue. Here, Karen showed up with her father when Margret was alone at the house with her grandson, who she says was really stricken by the news, and understandably so. Margret says that Karen wanted to come in and grab some things upstairs. She says that she really regretted letting her do that because she should have held her off in the kitchen downstairs until more family members could come home or something like that. But she didn't say what kind of negative consequence resulted from letting Karen go upstairs, so this was a little bit unclear. Anyway, the Commonwealth also specifically asked her if she had had any dialogue with Karen at all when Margret was sitting at the kitchen island. Margret basically responds, no, we didn't have any exchange whatsoever. And that was about it. Now, when it comes time for cross-examination, this, of course, is a tricky witness to cross. A lawyer isn't required to cross-examine every single witness, and sometimes it's best simply to not cross them at all. In fact, sometimes that can signal strength to the jury that you're really not all that concerned about what it is that this witness had to say on the direct examination. And then other times, it's just a good idea to avoid potentially making yourself into the villain by going too hard in the paint against a very sympathetic witness. And Mrs. O'Keefe is a very sympathetic witness, obviously, even though there was definitely some tension detected regarding her relationship with Karen. And honestly, that's completely understandable, regardless of what the relationship was like before John died. I mean, if you think that your son's girlfriend killed your son, yeah, there's going to be some tension. But anyway, when it came time for her cross-examination, Jackson got up and simply said, I'm very, very sorry for your loss, and I have no questions for you. This was 100% the right way to go about this witness. He didn't cross-examine her, but he also didn't just dismiss her. He addressed her directly instead of waving her off by telling the judge, no cross, Your Honor. And say what you will about Jackson. Some people love him like I do. Some people really don't love him. That is a classy move. Anyway, then there was a little bit of argument outside the presence of the jury over a couple clips that the Commonwealth wanted to show to the jury. One of the clips, as it turned out, the defense actually didn't have a problem with, but the other one was of Karen describing going into Meadows Avenue when Margret was there. And according to Karen in the interview, Margret basically yelled at her from the kitchen island about how it looked like someone had hit John with a car or something along those lines. This is obviously totally inconsistent with what Margret had just testified to, and the defense objected to this clip on the grounds that this was an impermissible impeachment of the Commonwealth's own witness under Massachusetts law. The Commonwealth, however, argued that this was evidence of consciousness of guilt and that this should be admissible because it's Karen's own words. In the end, Judge Cannone said that she would think about it and give a ruling on the morning of day 3, so we'll see what happens then. Then the jury was brought back and they were shown this clip.
They had pulled into the driveway before me, so I was presuming she saw my cracked tail light and was thinking, did you hit my son? I could sense from her that she was looking at me very warily, and then when John's nephew came home, I just wanted to see him and squeeze him. I was quite uncomfortable. I said, Dad, come upstairs to the master bedroom. I said, I think I need to leave because I think John's mother thinks I did something to John.
Okay, so then they were on to the Commonwealth's fourth witness. This was Massachusetts State Police Trooper Nicholas Guarino. He testified in the first trial as a forensic expert about digital evidence related to phones and Karen's car, and his testimony here was along the same lines. He actually only testified on day 2 for a short bit, relatively speaking, and he didn't finish his direct testimony. Instead, they concluded his testimony for now so that he could be recalled later. But before they did, he testified about Celebrate extractions from phones, generally how it works, and how they got information from several people's phones in this case, and how they made reports from that information. Specifically, he was talking about John's phone, Karen's phone, Carrie's phone, and Jen's phone. There was definitely more to it, but I will save you the dry details here. We'll see Guarino again, and I'm sure that there will be plenty more to go over at that point. Okay, so on to the next witness and the last witness of the day. The Commonwealth's fifth witness was Canton Fire Department paramedic / firefighter Daniel Whitley. Whitley's testimony was basically to talk about Karen's psych evaluation after she made statements that she was going to harm herself on the morning that John was found. He said that he was there at 34 Fairview Road in response to a call that came in because someone was concerned after she allegedly said something like, if John is dead, I'm going to KMS. He testified that when he arrived, she was really, really upset. Understandable any way you look at this case, honestly. And that she kept asking if there was a chance that John could be alive outside for so many hours. Then there was this exchange that he had with her. He testified that she said, "I can't take care of the kids. These aren't even my kids. They're not even his kids." And then Whitley says that he said, "Well, it sounds like you have a really good support system to help you." And then she responded, "Do you know Kerry Roberts?" And he said, "As a matter of fact, I do. Apparently, he's her neighbor." Then Karen apparently said, "Anyone who knows Kerry wouldn't say that about her." To which he says that he responded something like, "Well, she showed up here, didn't she?" And in response, he says Karen rolled her eyes. Anyway, the other thing that he testified about was when Karen was actually at the hospital. He said that she was uncooperative and specifically about giving a urine sample. It seems that the Commonwealth is suggesting here that Karen had a specific reason for rejecting a urine test. And that likely has to do with how much alcohol the Commonwealth says that Karen may or may not have consumed the night before. Like maybe she knew that it would reveal a high alcohol content and she didn't want to get busted for it. However, on cross-examination, defense attorney David Yannetti hammered in a few things. For one thing, on that morning, there was a lot going on at 34 Fairview Road. This, of course, is to hint to the jury that later they're going to get into the fact that Brian Albert, a Boston cop, never went out of his house to look into what all the commotion was about on his front lawn. Second, he also pointed out that when Whitley was called in for a so-called Section 12, that's to respond to someone in psychiatric distress. This is helpful to the defense because the more Karen seems out of her mind that morning, the more people might be able to accept the idea that the things that she was saying and doing are not necessarily tied to reality. And that's especially helpful if the jury happens to think that she did in fact say, "I hit him, I hit him, I hit him." Yannetti also drew out of Whitley that when getting Karen's medical history, he learned that Karen has multiple sclerosis. This was described as a chronic and persistent disease that affects neurological and muscle control. And it is a progressive disease, which means that it gets worse over time. And I will say it does feel a little bit like a foreshadowing of an explanation that we might hear later in the trial. Anyway, Yannetti also pointed out that Whitley is Kerry's neighbor and that he also knows former Trooper Proctor. That former added to Trooper Proctor's name definitely felt a little bit like a twisted knife, I'm not gonna lie. But anyway, again, we hear the whisper of the defense's boogeyman, Trooper Proctor. The jury knows his name and they know that the defense hates him and they know that just about every witness so far has had some kind of a connection to him, but they haven't yet heard the details of what Proctor did. It is going to be very interesting to see what happens when they get there. Anyway, Yannetti ended it after pointing out that in the initial reporting from the event, including the patient care report, there was no mention of Karen's alleged snarkiness about Kerry Roberts that Whitley described in his testimony here. This is, of course, to suggest that there's at least a possibility that this was a new detail that somehow developed along the way. Whether the jury buys it or not is entirely up in the air. Anyway, at this point, it does feel a little bit early to know whether the Commonwealth is making real headway in this case. I will say that it does feel much more like a firmly put together case than it did the first time around. But the defense is still scoring points. Kerry's testimony was good for the Commonwealth, but certainly much shakier after her cross-examination. And that might fall apart even further with other witnesses' testimony. And the rest of the testimony of the day does feel like it's setting up a narrative, perhaps for something bigger. So we'll see where it goes. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Do you think the Commonwealth is scoring some major points, or is the defense successfully holding them back? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this, or at least found it interesting or informative. And if you did, I would love it if you would hit the like button. It does help us with the YouTube algorithm god. And if you're new here and you haven't done so already, be sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can find out when the next video is out there. And if you're really enjoying the content and you want to know how to best support the channel, consider becoming a member of Byte Club. You can join either through YouTube memberships or by becoming a supporter on Patreon. Links to both are in the description below. Otherwise, see you in the next one.